You're watching the award-winning GHS-TV, a nationally recognized student television station.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of GHS-TV's award-winning talk show Crosstalk. I'm your host, Scarlett Simpson. Each week in this time slot, we take a look at different issues, personalities, and events that affect you and our community. 50 years ago, during the height of the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed here in Memphis, Tennessee. His message in life and subsequent death still lives on today in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. Today, we are celebrating Dr. King's legacy by taking a look at his impact on the past, present, and future. We are excited to have a Memphian who marched with MLK during the sanitation strike in March of 1968. And we'll talk with an organizer for the local Black Lives Matter movement about how they are using Dr. King's message to further their own agenda. Our first guest is Brian Kuoba, Assistant Professor of African American Studies at the University of Memphis. Mr. Kuoba, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I want to start with the Montgomery bus boycott. The King family had only been in Montgomery for about a year when the movement began with Rosa Parks. Was this MLK's first foray into what became the civil rights movement?
Yes, indeed it was. And it's something that was very fortuitous because, King arrives in Montgomery at a time when, just before the Montgomery bus boycott happens, when they really were in need of somebody, younger, somebody who could provide a fresh face. Some of the ministers in Montgomery were not necessarily best positioned to lead such a disruptive action as the Montgomery bus boycott, and many of them were conservative and weren't interested in that. And so King comes in, he's a fresh face, he's young. Of course, there was a lot of work done by the women of Montgomery in particular. People like Joanne Robinson and Rosa Parks, even in the years before the boycott, there had already been discussions of boycott and things of that nature. And so it's a really dynamic community in Montgomery that existed prior to the boycott and that really laid the groundwork for them to be able to pull off such an inspiring, 386-day action, which actually desegregated the buses in Montgomery and set an example for the rest of the South about how to go about desegregating in a nonviolent way.
Well, his now famous speeches draw people in. What do you think it is about the speeches that captivate listeners?
I think King comes from a really rich tradition of African American oratory, going back at least to Frederick Douglass in the abolitionist movement, if not further, in which there's a real passion in his oratory. There's a real conviction. You almost feel the spirit move you as it's moving King.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper.
And it's an oral tradition which has roots even further back, I would argue, in West Africa in terms of the way in which knowledge was passed down, the way in which people communicated socially and at a communal level. And King really symbolized and channeled that tradition in really important ways, which is one of the reasons, obviously, why we know him so well and how he became such a leading voice within the civil rights movement of his era.
Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring in Whitney Capital.
Well, by the early 1960s, Malcolm X emerged from a radical part of the civil rights movement, which was very different from Dr. King's peaceful protests. Can you go into detail about these differences?
Yeah, I mean, one of the differences which you just touched on was the question of nonviolence. Certainly, King had a nonviolent philosophy and a nonviolent way of going about advocating for African Americans. And Malcolm X, by contrast, supported armed self-defense.
Who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin to such extent that you bleach to get like the white man.
That's not to say that he sought to be the aggressor in any case, and he actually, encouraged his followers and listeners not to initiate or not to be aggressive towards others, but simply that if they were attacked, that they had the right to defend themselves by any means necessary, which is how most animals in the world operate. They defend their lives or their survival however they can. I also think it's worth mentioning, though, that both of them, both Martin and Malcolm, became much more militant in some ways as their lives went on. And so, for example, Dr. King ends up denouncing the Vietnam War, talking about the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism as things that were plaguing the society, organizing the Poor People's Campaign, which was basically a march of the poor on Washington to shut down the nation's capital until economic justice was given. And that's not the King necessarily that most people remember, but that's the direction he was going in at the end of his life, and certainly here in Memphis supporting the sanitation workers. Similarly, Malcolm X moved from a very kind of rigid black nationalist position that he had in the Nation of Islam into a more expansive vision of social change, looking at the global structures of oppression and domination and the way in which the haves and the have-nots internationally needed to, that the have-nots internationally needed to work together and to try to change some fundamental things about the system. And so I think it's important for us not to freeze people in time, whether it's Martin or Malcolm or any other figure. These people are human beings, they're dynamic, they're learning over time, both from their own attempts to change society when it succeeds and when it fails. And I think we owe these ancestors of ours the respect and dignity of their humanity and seeing how they changed, how they evolved, how they grew and developed, in their thinking, and why they were ultimately both killed, which I think is because of the sort of more radical or more militant direction that both of them were traveling.
Well, you did mention the March on Washington, which is considered the watershed moment in the history of the civil rights movement. Can you talk about how this march was different to the others?
Yeah, I mean, the March on Washington was important and unique in some ways because it was really the largest and most high-profile demonstration in the nation's capital led by African Americans. Certainly a generation prior, in 1941, A. Philip Randolph had organized this March on Washington movement that was preparing to march on Washington if the Army wasn't desegregated. And Roosevelt, I think it was at the time, ended up desegregating or issuing some executive order that that Randolph and the marchers felt like was sufficient, so they called off that march. And so seeing the march in the 60s as kind of the culmination of this a longer process where African Americans had for decades been thinking about and in some cases taking action in the nation's capital, but just not on the scale that the March on Washington of '63 really demonstrated. And so I think it's a watershed in that people really saw for the first time in a very open and a very large scale and public way the power that the civil rights movement was beginning to cohere and coalesce, and in particular its ability to mobilize masses of people to the nation's capital.
Well, teens and young adults take pride in being inclusive and equal. Is this the future for our country, or is this just wishful thinking?
I think that really depends on what young people do, because if it's just the idea of equality or the idea of social justice and things of that nature, then yes, it will be wishful thinking, because we know that the society as it's structured now, there's nothing automatic about it that will lead to a social progression or social change. But if those ideas are put into practice in the ways that we've seen, for example, with the movement for Black Lives or the movement among youth against gun violence, those protests, those marches, those rallies, those actions that young people are taking are precisely what contributes to social change. And certainly historically we saw, in the 60s, students playing a really big role with the sit-ins and the freedom rides and things of that nature. So young people are always at the forefront of social change, and I think if they put in that work, it will bear fruit.
Well, Mr. Kuoba, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
We have to take a short break, but when we return, we will talk with a guest who witnessed firsthand the type of impact that Martin Luther King had on people. Stay with us.
It's the one time of year when the bargains come to you. Germantown High School Television's Auction 2018, right here on GHS-TV.org. Bid on great items like theater tickets, restaurant gift certificates, artist prints, and much more. Online bidding begins April 14th, and be sure to tune into the live broadcast hosted by members of the community, alumni, and students. Saturday, April 28th from 2 to 5 p.m. on GHS-TV.org. All proceeds benefit GHS-TV, a nationally recognized student TV station. Bid online and don't miss your chance to win.
The instrumental music program here at Germantown High School is special because of all the things that we'll do throughout a year. We start the year doing marching band, and very quickly we move into concert band. We provide the orchestra for the spring musical. We just have myriad things that we take part in throughout the year.
My favorite part of being in the band is probably all of the different kinds of musics we play.
We have a woodwind ensemble, or a brass, a jazz ensemble.
All those different opportunities create a place for students who excel in different areas. I think that diversity allows us to be one of the most unique programs in the area.
For more information about the Kappa program, visit ghskappa.com or call 755-7775. You're watching the award-winning GHS-TV, a nationally recognized student television station.
We shall overcome. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome.
If it wasn't for the strike, we wouldn't have nothing. We'd been in the same shape if it wasn't for the strike.
I couldn't hardly make it home. It was so rough there. Them two up there was heavy. You told them on your head, had holes in them, stuff falling all over you. But I had to make a living.
You know, you need respect like everybody else, you know, like any other man, any white man, black man, whatever, you know. I'm a man, treat me right.
And they stood up and they said, we're not going to take it no more. We're going to stand and fight. First thing we did was put the Lord in front of us. And he got it because we know that when we walked out, we know we realized that we was going to face a lot of things. But we stood up and we kept on fighting.
I think about the hard times we did, hard times. We had some hard times. I come up when it was bad. We were there. And when I think about it, I don't like to talk about it too much, but I talks about it. But yeah, I went through some rough times.
Welcome back to Crosstalk. In February of 1968, 2 black sanitation workers were crushed to death when the compactor mechanism of the trash truck was accidentally triggered during a heavy storm. That and a separate incident also related to the inclement weather sparked the Memphis sanitation strike that would bring Martin Luther King Jr. here to Memphis for a march. One of those courageous sanitation workers who marched with Dr. King is here with us today, Mr. Elmore Nickleberry. Mr. Nickleberry, it is an honor to have you here today.
Thank you.
Well, can you describe the working conditions that led sanitation workers to have the strike against the city?
During that time, we had a strike that we was going in people's backyard picking up garbage. And first time I got hired at the city sanitation department, I stood out the gate for about 2 weeks. And then I stood out the gate for 2 weeks. Then the man asked me, do you want a job, boy? I told him, yes, sir, I want a job. He said, come on in. I went in, signed up, and the next morning he gave me number 3 tub. So we started going in people's backyard from house to house, picking up garbage. We used to empty them 55-gallon drums and we empty it in our tub. Then we bring the tub out there on our heads, and then we'll carry it to the truck, and the man of the truck take it off our heads and put it on the truck. And sometimes the tubs had holes in it, then the waste come all down my clothes and down my back and stuff like that. And then from week to week, I stood. Sometimes I carried garbage in my hand. Then next 2 weeks, I get inside the truck, and they bring the garbage to me, and I dump it out the truck, dump it in the truck, and then stuff get all over my clothes, and I get it all down in my shoes. That's what happened during that time. And most of the time, I couldn't ride the bus.
Were you a part of the group that organized the strike, or did you know someone who was?
I wasn't part of the group, but I know somebody, Jones, T.O. Jones, wanted to organize a strike during that time.
Now, how did you get involved in the strike?
Well, I got involved in the strike. We had a fellow coming around passing the literature. So when they started passing the literature, I took one and read it, and they told me that it was going to go join the strike. But most of the time, if you get one of the papers and they catch you with it, they'll fire you right on the spot.
Well, during the daily marches from the Claiborne Temple to downtown, you were faced with all kinds of police brutality.
Right.
Can you talk about that?
During that time, I was marching. I got hit on my shoulder, and police threw tear gas all over me. So I run through the alley, then I circle around, come back to the Union Hall. When I come back to the Union Hall, we just sat down and talked about what they did to us during that time.
Well, when we talk about the strike, the image of the iconic "I am a man" sign comes to mind. How did this slogan come to fruition?
The slogan come through Joe Warren. We went down in the basement and they started to get a slogan that we was a man. So it was a close slogan. He the one started the slogan that we was a man.
Can you talk about how it felt to be involved in a strike like this, both of the negative and the positive sides?
It felt mighty bad to me. I went overseas and come back. I went overseas. I come back, couldn't find no job. And so when I couldn't find no job, I had a family to feed. So I had to work for the city. And it was mighty bad because during that time it was rough for us. We didn't have no place to take a shower, wash our hands or nothing. And most of the time we would go to the filling station, use the bathroom. That's the only thing we did during that time.
Well, the night before his assassination, Dr. King told a group of sanitation workers, quote, "We have to give ourselves to this struggle until the end. Nothing would be more tragic than to stop at this point in Memphis. We've got to see it through." How do you think his words inspired those around him?
The word inspired all the sanitation men, because Dr. King was a great man, and he talked about nonviolence, and we try to do nonviolent, try to be nonviolent, but during that time, the police was attacking us. We didn't have nothing to fight with, and we marched nonviolent.
Can you describe the reaction that both you and your colleagues had when you heard the news that Dr. King was shot at the Lorraine Motel?
When I heard that Dr. Martin got shot, I was on my way down there, and I got halfway down there. Then somebody told me he got shot, so I turned around and come back home, because it started burning and stuff like that.
Well, what were some of the direct results of the sanitation strike?
We were working for better working conditions, more pay, and being treated like a man.
In addition to honoring the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's death, cities across the nation honored you and your fellow sanitation workers by holding a moment of silence and demonstrating the tag "I am a man 2018."
Right.
What other ways are you marking the anniversary?
I go to different schools and talk about nonviolence, tell kids about nonviolence, how to be nonviolent. Violence don't get you nothing. It gets you in a whole lot of trouble. So he believed in nonviolence, and I believe in nonviolence. I always did believe in nonviolence.
After 50 years, what do you hope that people take away from the sanitation strike?
After 50 years, I think they should understand how the garbage men come up during the strike and take pattern after what they did. We did come up in history. That should go down from years and years around to let the kids know how the sanitation during the strike, how they did.
Mr. Nickleberry, what would you say to today's younger generation fighting for rights and recognition?
I think to say to the young generation, take the torch and keep on doing what you're doing. Do the right thing, march and still go to school and get a good education. Without a good education, you have nothing. You can't come for nothing. Nothing you can come for. So I think a kid should learn about the history, about the sanitation program, and get an education. Try to respect other people and try to respect everybody. And when you get a certain age, be a man. Stand up and be a man. That's what I think.
It seems like there has been a constant struggle for racial equality and for just racial justice. Do you think that will ever be dissolved?
I think so. I think this year will be a better year. But I always expect that people get together. We are apart now, but everybody should get together and do the right thing. I think so.
Well, Mr. Nickleberry, thank you again for being on the show today.
All right, thank you for having me.
We have to take another short break, but when we return, we will wrap up our discussion on Dr. King and his impact on the Black Lives Matter movement. Stay with us.
It's the one time of year when the bargains come to you. Germantown High School Television's Auction 2018, right here on GHS-TV.org. Bid on great items like theater tickets, restaurant gift certificates, artist prints, and much more. Online bidding begins April 14th, and be sure to tune into the live broadcast hosted by members of the community, alumni, and students. Saturday, April 28th from 2 to 5 p.m. on GHS-TV.org. All proceeds benefit GHS-TV, a nationally recognized student TV station. Bid online and don't miss your chance to win.
Hello and welcome to Cable Quiz, the academic.
Do you know how incredible it is to work at a TV station in high school?
GHS-TV is a student-run television station.
There's so many things you can do here at GHS-TV. You can be in front or behind the camera or both. You have that opportunity. There are no limits.
Well, we have sports and we have news and we have entertainment. So the students here get a well-rounded view of what it's like to be in the TV field.
It's my life. It's what I want to do.
From all of us here at GHS-TV, thanks for starting your morning with us. For more information about the Kappa program, visit GHSKappa.com or call 755-7775. You're watching the award-winning GHS-TV, a nationally recognized student television station.
Welcome back to Crosstalk. I'm Scarlett Simpson. Let's wrap up our discussion of Dr. King's legacy by looking to the future. His dream has inspired a new generation of activists who are campaigning against the same thing Dr. King rallied against: violence and systematic racism towards Black people. Here with us now is Shahida Jones from the Black Lives Matter Memphis chapter. Ms. Jones, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, first off, can you relate the similarities of the Black Lives Matter movement and the civil rights movement, as well as the differences?
I'll try. I think the similarities are, as you just stated, that we're still fighting for systemic injustices. We're still fighting for a change in material conditions for people of poverty as well as people of color. And I think the biggest, difference is now we have a better understanding of what the difference between equality and equity is, and we're more now changing our ask and our demands to be more about equity than it is about equality.
Well, the movement started off with a simple yet powerful hashtag. How important has social media been to your movement?
Extremely important. I think it's the way that we've learned about most of the issues that have mobilized people. It's the way that we get our message across. It's the way that we've been able to shape and create our own narrative outside of what traditional media has done. And so it's been a major piece of our movement.
Well, you mentioned creating your own narrative. 50 years ago, it was easy for civil rights leaders to control their narrative with just newspapers and television. But now with the influence of social media, do you believe that it's harder or easier to control your narrative?
I don't think they get to control their narrative at all during the civil rights movement, which is why I think one of the things we see a lot of which is why the narrative for Dr. King has been, I don't want to say whitewashed, but I said it. But I think that's so I think it's definitely easier with the invention of social media, because what that allows us to do is to push back against what you see in the media. And I don't think that they had the ability to do that then. And I think that's why until you actually start organizing, you kind of have this perfect storm idea that everything happened perfectly during the civil rights movement. Everybody held hands and sang Kumbaya, and it was like, oh, everybody got along great. But I think when you dig a little deeper, you see that that wasn't the case. And so I think that that's, and I think that's important, right? Because when you are doing this work, it's very heavy, and you don't want to feel like a failure. So if you're modeling yourself against this perfect protest and this perfect movement, you don't participate. And I think that's intentional too. So I definitely think that being able to create the narrative, being able to show as we grow, show how we've changed, show how our thoughts and patterns and things change. You know, capitalism wasn't something we talked about as part of a systemic issue or a systemic structure 20, 30, 40 years ago. Now we're now talking about how that capitalism plays into a lot of the systemic issues that we experience. So.
Well, when you joined the movement, was there a moment or event that made you realize that it was time?
I think like a lot of people, Trayvon Martin is where I started to more formally get involved with the movement. Locally, it was though that I started organizing around the Darius Stewart campaign. And Darius Stewart was a young man that was killed by a police officer. He was picked up, he was a passenger in the car, driven down the street, we still don't know why, and ended up in a scuffle that resulted in the police officer shooting him. And so locally, that was the time that I started organizing or taking lead in an organizing role.
Well, why do you think it's especially important to have the Black Lives Matter movement in Memphis?
I think it's important to have the Black Lives Matter movement everywhere, but specifically in Memphis because Memphis is a majority Black city, and so here's where we can affect change. We actually have the resources, we actually have the people to mobilize and affect political change. And I think it's also just important to be able to contradict some of the things that we've been told and some of the things that we've been trained to push back against stereotypes and be able to declare loudly, proudly, unapologetically that Black Lives Matter, not in addition to, not with any caveats, but just loud and proud. And I think that's something that we need, and I think that's something that little Black kids need. I think little Black girls and adults all need to be able to tie into that, buy into that, and believe that.
Well, Ms. Jones, thank you so much for shining light on the Black Lives Matter movement.
Thank you.
If you would like to get involved or get more information on Black Lives Matter, you can check them out on their website at blacklivesmatter.com. I would like to thank all of our guests for being on the show today and sharing such valuable information about the impact Dr. King has had on people in life and death. All of your knowledge and history will help keep his message alive for another generation. Remember, Crosstalk can be seen each week at 9:30 a.m. and 7 p.m. on Mondays and Thursdays, Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2 a.m., and 12 p.m. and 7 p.m. on Sundays. For more information on our programming, please check us out on the web at GHS-TV.org, where we are streaming live 24 hours a day. You can also check us out on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Scarlett Simpson. From all of us at GHS-TV, thank you for watching Crosstalk, and I hope to see you again.